First of all, I want to thank the organizers who invited me to be here. I'm going to be speaking on a topic called the Creative Continuum, and I want to present it as a reflection on what I would call our natural brain-changing, technology is not the right word, facility, sort of built into our social behavior. Thank you for your attention, and I'll let you know when I'm ready to turn the slides. You can actually turn the slide now. Well, all the slides are going to be dark, I can tell, but this is one of my own drawings, all color pencil. But when I was a young student attending the High School of Art and Design in New York City, I sometimes chose to give my art away. It is important to know how out of character this was for me. I'm a methodical art maker. It takes a lot of time, and to this day I'm quite content if my work stays in my studio and surrounds me. I've rarely even sold my art, and for me to choose to give something away that I toiled to craft and shape, it had to strike me that someone else needed it more than I did. I also started writing poetry in high school for the sole reason of addressing it to friends of mine who were downcast. I knew what it felt like to suffer in silence as an introverted and isolated teen. And when I saw someone else at the risk of being swallowed in the same kind of abyss that I barely escaped myself, I doubled back sometimes through artistic portals with the hope that it could reveal an escape route. As I reflect back, I realize that I was intentionally practicing art as an altruistic exercise. Why? What response was I attempting to trigger in the receiver of my gifts? It is clear that at the time, I sought little more than to state I was once in your shoes and I know a better way, a better position, follow me. But taking a second look, the smallest acts of altruism have a way of spreading, like creative contagion, huge social advantages, stuff that cultures are made of. Why do we give little bits of ourselves away to those we associate with and care for? This kind of interpersonal exchange is the essence of art making, but it's also the essence of altruism. Altruism is not concerned with the survival of the fittest, but rather with the survival of the patterns that have proven to advantage and sustain us. However, the thoughts and patterns of individuals like you and me do not constitute cultural patterns in isolation. Others must be enticed to do likewise. Next slide, please. Well, this is totally bad. This is a bridge of ants. We'll deal with what we can over here. So the construction of whatever cultures we call home of our most enduring systems of behavior require enticements, biocultural mechanisms that work like the excreted or secreted attractors of insect colonies, chemical pheromones, triggering a likewise response in the members of the local swarm. Next slide. Or somewhat like this is an overhead picture of bees doing that old waggle dance you've heard of. That vigorous figure-eight dance performed in bee colonies where the number of circuits that a bee takes when they arrive back at the hive gives the exact distance and direction in which to fly to find food or a new location to call home. Obviously, for most higher-thinking human beings, it takes quite a bit more than the transfer of precious bodily fluids or chemical markers or waggle dances to cause ideas to spread. Next slide, please. Looking back, it has been my ongoing effort to understand the effectiveness of the empathetic, aesthetic, and material transmissions I first initiated as a high school student over... the ceiling closes. Thank you. I've been thinking and mulling over this practice since I started engaging in over 30 years ago, and that leads me to this presentation here, namely a theory that I'd like to present on the idea of swarm intelligence, a theory of shared adaptive social advantages. Individual creativity is collectively fostered. In other words, there are no orphan imaginations. Our imaginations take us from where we are to where we might be, but where we are is always the offspring of the ideas, the languages, the materials and processes and access that we've been born into. As a social behavior, creative activity is indeed a catalyst for human achievements, obviously. But first and foremost, it is a catalyst for human development and innovations. Hence, creativity has evolutionary implications. Civilization's most enduring achievements are the actions and products of creative swarms, each group adapting to the questions or quandaries at hand. Nevertheless, writ small, creativity also has utterly personal implications. This is why we paint ourselves in visual narratives, sing ourselves in lyric and verse, dramatize ourselves in the round, glorify ourselves in marble and clay, write ourselves into histories and her stories, dance ourselves into states of oblivion, and dream ourselves in abstracts through the night. The feedback loop between evolutionary growth and individual human development may be understood as the creative continuum. Next slide, please. I would argue that it is a fallacy to refer to creative individuals as if there were no such thing as a non-creative individual. Is there even such a thing as a less creative individual? After all individuals are equally predisposed to create. We each create meaning. We each create our own approach to language and conversation. We each create an identity in the world. We each create actions. As youngsters, we each create wild stories, imaginary friends, and playful diversions. We each create new questions as we experience our local worlds. When you or I walk through a space, we create a unique trajectory, a pathway. We create relationships with one another. We create common beliefs. We create situational behaviors and choose from an array of possible responses. We create change. We create culture. We create civilization. We create order or disorder. We create havoc. We procreate. We recreate. We create recreations. Infrequent displays of creative activity are arguably less a matter of innate psychological deficit than contextual or circumstantial barriers to creative capacity. Nevertheless, the efforts to understand creativity have tended to run the gamut from biographical and historical approaches, clinical interventions, psychometric measures, correlational studies, applied strategies, systems approaches, developmental studies, case studies, cross-cultural inquiries, and computer modeling. This is not surprising. In a November 12th posting on Public Radio International, James H. Borland, an expert on giftedness and a professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, reflected upon a fundamental problem, simply that there is no agreement on what creativity is. Quoting Borland, "I'm not sure I have a definition of creativity," he said. "It's one of those human constructions that isn't discovered but invented. It's a word we use in everyday speech, and it makes perfect sense, but when you start to study it and try to separate out its constituent parts, it becomes more and more confusing." Next slide, please. Frank Barron, a pioneer in the study of the psychology of creativity, wrote, "At the very heart of the creative process is this ability to shatter the rule of law and regularity in mind." Following from Barron, Alfonso Monturi argues that creativity means shaking things up, both inside ourselves and in the world around us, and constantly reorganizing both cognitive schemata and, to a greater or lesser extent, the domain of the creative person's activity. But what is often overlooked in domains and theories of individual creative processing is the social interaction that ceaselessly instigates this kind of psychological shaking and reorganization of the cognitive patterns in the world around us. As social creatures, we're each constantly shaken in the aftermath of a daily clash of competing aims and motivations as we encounter others traveling in divergent directions with entirely different frames of mind. This is the shaking that routinely alters our own intellectual and emotional inertia. Consequently, we find ourselves swerving and converging and navigating new routes to our destinations. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi presents a systems theory of the process of creativity, which he defines as a phenomenon that is constructed through an interaction between a producer and an audience, whereby creativity is not the product of single individuals, but of social systems, making judgments about individuals' products, and processes. Next slide, please. But what if your creativity is not locked up in your head? What if it is neither your personal property nor your private advantage? In a social hive, each one creates. Each member is producer of expressions, actions, and behaviors with the potential to entice or divert others to think, act, and behave likewise. In other words, everyone is influence and each one is audience. If creativity is as collective as I'm suggesting, a more apt understanding of the process of human development and individual achievement within the human creative continuum can be summarized as a phenomenon that is constructed through an interaction between members of a sociocultural swarm, whereby creativity is not the product of a single individual, but of social systems regulating themselves by feeding back cues towards the transmission and spread of ideas and behaviors that aid that system's resilience. A social system works to maintain the survival of its own characteristic patterns over time, whether through growth, contraction, periods of equilibrium, or evolutionary leaps. In other words, I'm arguing that social processes do not merely influence individual creativity. Social processes are the basis for the emergence and development of individual creativity. The process is both part and whole. Next slide, please. A video went viral over YouTube late in 2011 showing two young ladies in a canoe as they encounter a massive cloud of starlings wheeling about over the River Shannon in Ireland. It's an amazing sight when a flock of thousands of birds suddenly changes direction at what appears to be exactly the same time. They're engaging in a form of collective intelligence, a phenomenon that is found in evidence across the animal world. This phenomenon also serves as a metaphor for collective, collaborative, creative leadership. The shape-shifting flock of starlings in this YouTube video, ebbing and flowing through the air at speeds up to 20 miles per hour, is called a murmuration. To view this phenomenon is to glimpse a natural manifestation of this swarm intelligence common to all social animals, including human beings. In the case of a murmuration of starlings, the swarm is made up of thousands of small winged organisms, each bird acting on the basis of its own individual perceptions and choices. Each starling in the flock will rotate to the front of the ranks at some point in the journey. Every bird in the flock chases after those in the lead, separates from those too close for comfort, aligns with those who they're attempting to keep pace with, and coheres with one another as they converge towards the same general direction. This shape-shifting, kaleidoscoping, and seemingly reckless concert of autonomous breakneck actions somehow self-organizes into coherent patterns of collaboration and interchanging leadership that ultimately carries the flock from point A to point B to the point just beyond. Next slide, please. This group decision-making intelligence is governed by natural laws of instinct, thought, behavior, and action common to all social creatures. Next slide. The individual members of a swarm of social activity chase after those directly ahead of them in the ranks of leadership, fostering their own adaptability and forward momentum over time in adherence to the law of succession. Next slide, please. The members of a swarm of thinkers separate from those too close for comfort, preventing a chain of disorienting or disabling collisions that would slow the progress of the group toward its next position in adherence to the law of separation. Next slide, please. The members of a swarm learn to align with those alongside them, keeping pace with a cohort of peers so that no member of the group gets left behind in accordance with the law of alignment. Next slide, please. And finally, the individual members of a swarm of social activity cohere together with those in their vicinity, coalescing so as to arrive at point B at just about the same time, ensuring their greatest critical mass through the strength and security of overwhelming numbers as they converge upon their selected target in accordance with the law of cohesion. Swarm intelligence is a theoretical concept that makes sense of the social origins of creativity, makes visible its life-sustaining and evolutionary purpose. Swarm intelligence is the explanation for why ideas first capture our attention, then affect our behavior, and then ultimately spread. Next slide, please. But here's the key. Sort of see folks in front of a giant aquarium, school of fish. Here's the key. Individuals never travel to point B alone. Don't believe the hype about individual achievement. Human beings are social creatures first. We survive our infancy because of the family units that foster us. We speak and perceive the world just like the social populations in which we're embedded. And we are swept into the future on the currents and eddies of our culture that our culture is churned as it interacts with the rest of the world. We give little bits of ourselves away because such are the actions that hold us together. We form beautifully crafted reflections of the world we've experienced. We inform new ideas emerging from ongoing dialogue. We transform present conditions into future questions and possibilities because such are the objects, expressions, and social interventions that we grasp as handholds along the way. Likewise, our most significant achievements as a human race are those achievements of collective mass and momentum, as when an improved idea or process suddenly chases ahead to the fore, past good practices and actions that once preceded it, or when a thought or a way of thinking finally separates itself from the jam of competing ideas out of which it emerged to make itself useful to the many, or when new partners choose to align so that no one is left behind, or when disparate parties converge to seek and secure the common good. Next slide. Yeah. So it follows that the greater the synergy and mass of social movement, the greater the momentum toward point B. We can postulate that creative achievement is the product of unique life experience and the agency it affords within a given social group, augmented by the information individuals can access and make use of as that information compounds exponentially exponentially as information does. Thus, for the sake of argument, creative achievement is equivalent to for the sake of argument, creative achievement is equivalent to the agency of experience multiplied by the information an individual has access to as that information continues to compound itself. This formula for adaptive creative transmissions means that creativity and experience are two ways of looking at the same thing, namely how human beings effectively relate and develop viable, enduring social clusters. Alex Wright defines information as the juxtaposition of data to create meaning. Thus, the creative impulse is also the impulse to make meaningful sense of the world that surrounds us. Given the right conditions, experience can be converted to creative behavior, since life experience is simply one of the manifestations of thoughts, ideas, words, and actions as we each create. This equivalence is a consequence of the constancy of information, whether in verbal or visible or written forms. Information is independent of your own embodied frame of reference. Information can be left behind as a cue or an enticement, let's say in the form of a book or a painting or a work of architecture. Likewise, information behaves as a constant, appearing and behaving the same way across all frames of reference. Access to information always deepens experience and creativity. What changes is the interpretation or translation of the value of that information from one person's frame of reference to the next. Hence, this formula for creativity, that creativity equals the agency of collected life experience multiplied by the information that we have access to, helps us to understand and explain the continuum of creative human interaction as a culmination of the natural laws that shape social behavior. This is also a formula for jumpstarting the creative economy and fostering creative leadership and innovation. Creativity, after all, is human behavioral energy, for good or for bad. We ceaselessly create and network a system of thoughts, ideas, expressions, and actions relative to our local experience of the world and to those with whom we choose to relate. Next slide. So here's some final implications. There are several, and I'll just focus on three. First, if creativity is more than an individually owned trait and is more accurately understood as a set of behaviors stemming from and sustained through our relational transmissions, it presents a remedy to the powerful mythology that some people are gifted with special creative capacities while most others are not. If creativity originates as a social behavior, its outcomes are immediately amplified when we transmit our ideas and our materials and our tools in schools or in workplaces or on our own time. Every act of sharing, altruism, gift-giving, social networking, and exchange has the potential to alter the script for everyone in the play who contributes to verse. Second implication, if creativity originates as a social behavior, it also changes everything with regard to how we approach fostering creativity, both in ourselves and in those we love. Nothing could be more important, because if creativity originates as a social behavior, our creative activity is both the continuing evidence and the continuing means for the success of every individual, every family, every classroom, every society, every company, and every nation. A formula for adaptive creative transmissions suggests a new blueprint for public education, wherein instructional goals and policies are rewritten to facilitate learning by behaving together as citizens of the world. The great secret to closing the achievement gap between educational outcomes for those who are privileged to have and those who have not is to increase the regular access of all students to provocative exchanges. The more classrooms without borders that we can enable, the more the creative continuum will close the gaps between learners. The most successful of these proposed classrooms without borders would be, for instance, like a Khan Academy, would be those that show evidence of the greatest autonomy to self-organize, its learning aims, the greatest diversity and range of life experiences amongst those within the community with whom exchanges are made, would show the greatest opportunities to be informed by indirect collaborations and interactions with other outside communities, both synchronously and asynchronously. And it would also show the greatest propensity for adaptive mimicking of the knowledge and advantageous behaviors that others have developed. Finally, if creativity originates as a social behavior, the symbiotic relationship between our collective problem-solving genius and each person's individual capacity also has international economic implications. Most of you are familiar with a recent IBM survey that found that 1,500 CEOs in 60 countries identified creativity as the #1 leadership quality of the future, that U.S. employers rate creativity and innovation amongst the top 5 skills, and rank the arts and study of the arts as one of the most important indicators of a potential creative worker. So a formula for adaptive creative transmission suggests that the arts and design practices have long been central to developing the business imagination and avenues for the dissemination of mutually advantageous human achievements. There's much to gain from revisiting the centrality of the arts for economic revitalization, and all nations should perhaps give the best of their art, the best of their ideas, their architecture, and their designs away, in the sense that, for the reason that in that way, the patterns of our greatest successes while behaving together as human beings are sure to be extended. Thank you.